Hey friends, today I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with PMDD, what PMDD is, what the symptoms are, and how I personally got diagnosed. I have talked to a lot of people who think they may have PMDD or have never heard of it but are experiencing the symptoms, and I want to kind of break that down for you in today's video. Quick content warning for discussion of taking prescription medication, mental health issues, and self-harm. Listener discretion is advised. Hey, if this is our first time seeing each other, I'm Leavell. I'm a certified personal trainer, group fitness instructor, entrepreneur, and today I'm talking about my experience with PMDD. If you have never heard of PMDD, it stands for Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder. If you or someone you know has a menstrual cycle, you have probably heard of PMS, which is premenstrual syndrome, but PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So they are two different things, although sometimes they do have a little bit of an overlap. What is the difference between PMDD and PMS? I think that they are often confused, and when I tell people I have PMDD, or when I suggest to people that they look into PMDD, they say, oh yeah, like PMS. Kind of, but not really. PMS is typically a little bit of a physical change. Maybe it is chest and breast tenderness, cramping, bloating, the traditional like classic like, oh, I'm craving chocolate, I'm craving whatever. Those are typical PMS symptoms, and people who have PMDD can experience all of those symptoms and then the mental health symptoms on top of that. So the anxiety, the depression, the mood swings, the rage, all of those things on top of the physical symptoms that you may be getting from traditional PMS. I don't think PMS is anything to roll your eyes at all. I think it is a really hard thing to deal with, absolutely. But I do want to differentiate that PMDD can be extremely dangerous for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. They can end up quitting jobs, breaking up with partners, fighting with family members, doing things that can be extremely destructive for their lives. And this plays into a stress feedback that can ultimately cause people to self-harm or take their own lives. PMDD has a wide variety of symptoms. They differ from person to person. So the symptoms that I'm going to list off, you may have some of them, you may not. They just depend on what person is experiencing it, and they can also change from month to month. So some of the symptoms are classified as more mental. They can be things like increased anxiety, increased depression, really major mood swings, feelings of self-harm, like you want to self-harm, fighting with people around you, bouts of rage. Those are a lot of like the mental health symptoms, but there's also increased physical symptoms. So on top of like the regular feelings of cramps, it could also be sleep schedule being disrupted, so either needing a lot of sleep or experiencing bouts of insomnia. Digestion can get disrupted. You can also have issues with food, either food aversion, feeling extra hungry, not feeling hungry at all. So there's a lot of different symptoms, and their intensity is kind of what predicts if it is PMDD. So the timing and the intensity is what really tells people, is this PMDD? People who experience PMDD typically experience the symptoms before they have their period. So it's typically from after they ovulate to right before they start their period or right when they do start their period. From my personal experience, I actually had never heard of PMDD before I got diagnosed. I was diagnosed when I was 27 years old. I went to a routine wellness checkup where I got a pelvic exam, I got a lot of tests run, and the actual physician sat with me and talked to me about a lot of different things. She went over a really long list. It was pretty comprehensive, which if you are in the United States, you know that can be really hard to find and pretty impressive. And she checked off a bunch of things, and she started asking me about my cycle and about my experience with my periods. And when I disclosed to her that I had issues with being on hormonal birth control and that I did experience symptoms of PMS, or that I thought were PMS, she started probing a little bit further. So she started asking me about my mood, about my mental health history, which at the time I had never been on medication for mental health. I had never been like consistent with therapy. I went to therapy when I was a little bit younger, but I had never consistently seen a therapist or any of that. And also when I was 27, I actually didn't have a lot of time or money to do that, but whatever. And she got to the end of the checklist and said, I think all of these symptoms you are experiencing are potentially PMDD. And it really took me by surprise and actually like kind of crushed me because it feels like I had been going through this and didn't understand what was going on. So it was a really big deal for someone to take that time and go through that checklist with me. And that's why I feel like it's important for me to talk about now. Her original suggestion was for me to go on an SSRI, so an anxiety or depression medication for mental health, and that can be done with PMDD either part of the month or all of the month. Because the symptoms typically start halfway through your cycle, you don't actually have to take the medication for the entire month. We have already discussed that every body is different. So for some people, taking the medication all month long is actually going to work better for them. They won't have to remember to start taking the medication, which is a big deal because PMDD has a couple of comorbidities that we can get to. But they won't have to remember to start taking the medication. They'll just be taking it all the time and it will stay in their system. They won't really have to do that bigger uptick when they're needing to take it halfway through their cycle. The other option is taking the medication after you ovulate, which would require that you have a regular cycle, that you know how to track your cycle, that you know when you ovulate, and those can be factors that can be very different from person to person and even from month to month. So I chose to take medication for the entire month because I thought that would be a better bet for me. I'm just going to get adjusted to this medication and I will move forward from there and figure it out. One thing about this space, it is not a space for medication shaming, medical intervention shaming whatsoever. I was able to get control over my PMDD, or at least learn more about my body, learn more about the symptoms by taking an SSRI. I had never taken anxiety medication. I had never taken medication for depression or any of those things before I started taking this medication for PMDD. And I will tell you that it was absolutely life-changing and life-preserving for me. And I am no longer taking an SSRI for my PMDD. I want to say this because I think it's important. I was very shocked that that was a line of defense that was offered to me after my diagnosis. That just wasn't what I was anticipating from this process. And it took a little bit for me to get used to the idea of taking that medication. And I want to let people know that if that is a suggestion, that it's something worth looking into and it's absolutely something worth trying. And for some people, it will be perfect. It will be the thing that works the best for them. I realized that it worked the best for me in the moment after my diagnosis and for a little while after that. And I was able to find things moving forward and learn more about my body. And I no longer need to take an SSRI for my PMDD. I think a lot of times we get really hard on ourselves or we beat ourselves up for having to take medication or needing medical intervention of any kind. And I don't think that that should be the case. I think, again, this was important life-saving medication for me. And I also want to say that sometimes you don't have to be on medication forever for that medication to have been effective and life-changing. So with PMDD, I think some people could be very enthusiastic about taking medication and want that, and maybe it will work for some of the symptoms of PMDD, or maybe it will take care of all of them. But for me, it was a bridge to being able to find out what works best for my body and for my cycle. And I'm extremely grateful that I leaned in to that process and didn't run away and didn't shame myself out of taking medication. I alluded to this earlier, but PMDD has a bunch of comorbidities or things that it's really good friends with. So folks who have PMDD typically also have other things that are going on. One of the main factors could be ADHD. ADHD and PMDD, they often run together. So if you are someone who has an ADHD diagnosis and you have been experiencing major mood swings or a lot of other physical and mental symptoms closer to your period, it may be worth investigating if you have PMDD and talking with your physician. Another one is autism. PMDD and autism also really have strong links. There are some studies that I've read that they are related, like 90% of people who have autism and who menstruate are prone to having PMDD. Again, these are just a few studies, and also there aren't a ton of studies on PMDD, but It is a really high likelihood, or a significantly higher likelihood, that someone who has ADHD or autism will also have PMDD. Additionally, people who have experienced trauma, people who have cPTSD are also more likely to experience PMDD. And so, again, just checking for these things that may go together. If you already have one of those other diagnoses and you have been experiencing similar symptoms to what I described earlier, it may be worth checking in with your physician and looking into potentially if you have PMDD. Sorting it all out, as a lot of people know, if you have a menstrual cycle, if you have to deal with going to a gynecologist or any of that is typically categorized under the umbrella of women's health, you know that a lot of things just don't get studied. So PMDD is kind of a big overhead, but I believe in the next few years, if people are committed to studying these things, we will start breaking those up into smaller pieces. And what I mean by that is PMDD exists and people know about it and it is acknowledged. But there's also something called PME, which is premenstrual exacerbation. So that could be that you have another condition or another, like maybe you already have anxiety. You have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety. And before your period, you experience increased anxiety. That might not be a symptom of PMDD. It might be something like PME, which is premenstrual exacerbation, which your symptoms of anxiety become worse around your period. But these things are not studied enough, so there are a bunch of other symptoms and a bunch of other overlaps that could be other things that we just don't have names for yet. There are a couple of different ways to get a PMDD diagnosis. I think a lot of people are getting diagnosed by their gynecologist or by their physician who they go to see for reproductive health. That is one option. I'm sure you can also get diagnosed by your general practitioner, your PCP, if you have a history with them and you've expressed your concerns, and they can really take a look into your health history. Another way to get a diagnosis is to have either your primary care doctor, your general practitioner, your gynecologist, or your reproductive health doctor refer you to a specialist, particularly a mental health specialist, who will take into account the things that you've talked about with your doctor and give you another type of diagnosis or give you a formal PMDD diagnosis. As I talked about, I was diagnosed by a gynecologist through a wellness check for reproductive health, but that does not happen to be the case for everyone. You can go about this in different ways, and I'm sure it's different from place to place, from insurance to insurance if you're in the United States, and outside of the United States from provider to provider. I'm sure it's going to be different. Getting a PMDD diagnosis may not be easy for everyone, but I think it is extremely important to have these conversations because they are truly life-saving conversations. I feel extremely passionate about talking about PMDD and openly discussing it with other people because, number one, what I already said multiple times, these things are not frequently studied. They're not studied enough. We don't have a lot of evidence-based studies around them, or if we do, they're not actually published for regular people. So people who are experiencing the symptoms don't really know what to look for, and they don't know it's out there. And because a lot of the symptoms of PMDD have to do with mental health, this is literally life-saving work because people who have PMDD often end up self-harming, self-destructing, or could potentially end up taking their lives. So I think it's really important to continue having these conversations and urging people to look into this and ask for help from their healthcare providers and from their communities. Since my own diagnosis, I have helped many friends in person and online get or pursue a PMDD diagnosis because, again, we are not having these conversations. I'm having these conversations now, and I encourage my friends who have gotten diagnosed, who've had experiences with talking to their doctor, to have these conversations because it is really important that we are talking to each other, that we are encouraging our healthcare providers to actually look into this, to actually perform real care for us. So I think the more people who are talking about it and discussing it, the better that care can be. If you have any questions about PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMS, any of these things, I would love to hear from you. I hope you found this video helpful because I wanted to find the people that it is meant for. If you are someone who has been diagnosed with PMDD, I would love to hear from you in the comments. And if you are someone who thinks you have PMDD and wants to learn more about pursuing that, I would also love to hear from you. I think it's really important to start building community around these things, because together we are going to make strides for this and hopefully push this into a more mainstream conversation and help actually save lives. Okay, love you so much.